I took my late wife's broken e-reader to a repair shop in Portland. The technician stared at the screen for a few seconds and then, out of nowhere, he locked the front door. His voice was barely a whisper. "Sir, you shouldn't let anyone see what's on this device." I frowned, completely lost. "What are you talking about?" He pushed the e-reader back across the counter, his eyes darting around nervously. "You need to listen to the last recording your wife left behind." I pressed play, and right then and there, I uncovered a truth that made my blood run cold. Welcome to today's story. Before we get into this mysterious recording, please like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Just a quick reminder, this is a fictional story. Some details have been dramatized for storytelling purposes and to offer a meaningful reflection. Any resemblance to real people or places is purely coincidental. The smell of burnt solder and ozone always gives me goosebumps, but today, the static in the air felt like a warning from the grave. I sat on a stool that groaned under my weight, feeling the grit of the repair shop floor beneath my boots. My name is Thane Garrison. I'm a 70-year-old retired hazelnut farmer, with hands calloused from 40 years of working the Oregon dirt. Right now, I was clutching my late wife's e-reader like it was a sacred relic. The screen was a spiderweb of shattered glass, looking like a jagged map. Of the exact moment, everything fell apart. Most people see a broken tablet and think about how much it's going to cost to replace it. But all I saw was the last thing Jessica was holding on to tightly when she collapsed on the kitchen floor. My kids thought I wanted it fixed so I could finish the historical fiction novels she loved, but that was just a convenient lie. I brought the device to Portland because I noticed that in her final moments, her fingers were locked onto it, almost as if she was trying to protect a secret from the very air she was losing. Our farmhouse had been dead quiet for 2 months, and the weight of that silence had become a physical burden I couldn't carry anymore without finding answers. Corbin Mercer, a 30-year-old electronics tech with wire-rimmed glasses and a nervous twitch, walked out from the back room looking visibly shaken. He didn't hand the device back to me across the cluttered counter. Instead, he scanned the shop to make sure no other customers were around before leaning in close. His pencil tapped a frantic rhythm against his clipboard, a sharp sound that grated on my nerves. I asked him if there was a problem with the bill, my voice sounding older and more tired than I cared to admit. That was when the deadbolt slid into place, with a sharp click sounding as final as a trap door snapping shut. Corbin signaled for me to follow him into the back room, steering clear of the storefront cameras. We stepped into a cramped space that smelled of old dust and warm plastic. I followed him, my heart hammering against my ribs. I've survived 70 Oregon winters, but the chill I felt right then had nothing to do with the weather. He had me sit in front of a terminal where the blue hum of a diagnostic monitor washed over us like a ghost. Corbin plugged the e-reader into the machine, his fingers trembling as he navigated through layers of code. To a man who spent his life studying soil pH and crop yields, it looked like a foreign language. He told me the storage drive didn't contain the novels I expected. Instead, the memory was packed with encrypted high-bitrate audio recordings disguised as ordinary system logs. How could a woman who barely knew how to send a text hide a digital trail so deeply? I stared at the screen, a cold dread pooling in my stomach. "These were hidden on purpose," Corbin whispered, his eyes darting back toward the door we just locked. "This isn't a glitch, and it's not an audiobook collection. These are timestamps and every single one matches up perfectly with the final week of your wife's life. He admitted he almost wiped the drive as part of the standard repair process until he noticed the file names. My curiosity was no longer a dull ache. It was an instinctive, screaming need to know what Jessica was so afraid of. Corbin's finger hovered over the play button on the diagnostic screen. His voice shook as he told me I needed to hear how it all started. A burst of static broke the silence, melting into a familiar, trembling voice that shook me to my core. Hearing Jessica's voice didn't feel like a comforting memory. It felt like a cold hand reaching out from the Oregon mist, grabbing me straight by the throat. I froze in that tiny back room, the blue light of the monitor casting long, sickly shadows across the cluttered workbench. The audio quality was rough, a low, whispered confession captured in the dead of night. "Thane," she said, and my name sounded like both a prayer and a warning. "If you're hearing this, those blue pills aren't mine. I had to hide the real medication because someone is swapping my bottles." I felt the air drain completely from my lungs. This wasn't just the digital diary of a grieving woman. This was a desperate trail of breadcrumbs left by a wife who knew her sanctuary had been breached. Corbin Mercer cut the audio off immediately, before those words could even settle in the air. He looked toward the locked door, his face pale, under the hum of the shop's fluorescent lights. He told me he couldn't let me listen to the rest of it there. If anyone was watching, it was far too dangerous for both of us. Looking down at the e-reader, my heart raced wildly. I realized it was no longer a relic. It was a ticking time bomb. Have you ever experienced that feeling when the ground beneath your feet completely vanishes while you're still standing? In that exact moment, I realized my home was no longer a safe haven, and the people I called family might just be the wolves I let through the front door myself. Corbin didn't charge me for the repair. Instead, he slid a pair of high-end, noise-canceling headphones across the scratched desk, his eyes constantly shifting to the security feed. He warned me that as long as I stayed within the standard reading interface, the files would remain invisible. But if someone tech-savvy looked into it, I would be in serious trouble. Leaning in, his voice barely a breath, he told me not to trust my family. Not a single one of them, until I listened to the very end of that file. I stuffed the device deep into the pocket of my wool coat, its weight pulling me down like a lead sinker. Stepping out into the freezing rain, the icy water soaked through my clothes as I climbed into my old truck. The smell of damp asphalt and pine filled the cab, but it did nothing to clear my head. I pulled onto Highway 99 West, the windshield wipers slapping frantically against the downpour. The rain wasn't just falling, it was attacking the glass like 1,000 tiny needles, as if trying to wash away the sins of my own bloodline. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, my mind racing back to the night Jessica passed away. I remembered my children hovering around her bedside, their faces masked with concern. I asked myself who exactly had been in that room that night, and how I could have been so blind. As I slowed down, I looked over at the e-reader on the passenger seat. In the dim glow of the dashboard lights, I noticed the spiderweb cracks on the glass again. They didn't radiate from a single impact point, like a regular drop would cause. It looked intentional, like someone had tried to ruin the device under a heavy boot heel. When the farmhouse finally appeared through the gray curtain of the storm, I saw a familiar silhouette standing on my porch, waiting in the dark. The headlights of my truck cut through the gloom, illuminating a figure I wasn't ready to see. I turned off the engine, but the sudden silence that followed was louder than the storm itself. The only thing breaking the quiet was the rhythmic creaking of a porch swing that shouldn't have been moving. My hand slid into the pocket containing the e-reader, its jagged screen, a cold weight against my thigh. I stepped out into the mud, the freezings instantly soaking through my wool coat, only to realize it was just Pete Miller, my 80-year-old neighbor, who had been farming the plot next to mine since we were kids. He looked spooked, his yellow raincoat glistening under the flickering porch light. "Thane," he said, his voice barely carrying over the wind, "you need to lock your gates. Those people in the black SUV, they weren't here looking for hazelnuts." I felt the metallic taste of adrenaline sharpen in the roof of my mouth. Pete told me that while I was in town, he saw Silas, my own flesh and blood, sneaking around my property, looking for men who looked like they'd never stepped in mud in their lives. He handed me a damp envelope he'd found stuffed in my mailbox and shuffled back to his own truck. I urged him to get home safe, my paranoia blooming like a dark flower as I locked the front door with trembling hands. I retreated to the kitchen, the only room that still faintly smelled of Jessica's lavender and lemon peel. The storm battered the farmhouse rhythmically, feeling like a giant fist trying to break its way in. Sitting at the oak table, under a yellowed, flickering bulb, I put on the noise-canceling headphones Corbin had given me. I selected the first file, labeled Blue Supplements. Jessica's voice filled my mind, and for a second, the grief was so physically intense, I nearly doubled over. But her voice was steady, almost clinically calm, as she detailed a trip she took to a pharmacy in McMinnville, 2 towns over. She explained that she had taken the vitamins. Silas had been bringing her to a professional to be tested. A shutter blew loose outside, sounding like a gunshot through the empty house. I jumped, my heart clawing inside my chest before the recording pulled me back in. Jessica cleared her throat and said the pharmacist told her those weren't vitamins at all. It was warfarin, a blood thinner, prescribed at a dosage 5 times what a woman her size should ever take. The pharmacist's cold, clinical verdict echoed in my ears through her words. My wife described the physical toll it took on her, the deep purple bruises hidden beneath her long sleeves, and the constant metallic taste that ruined every meal I cooked for her. Jessica's voice was a ghostly bridge, the only thing keeping me from drowning in the black ink of my own disparant, as she explained why she stayed silent. She was terrified that if I confronted Silas, I would end up harmed too. At the end of the file, she told me she had hidden the pharmacy receipts in the hollow of the old oak tree we always called our wedding tree. But then, her tone shifted into something much more urgent. She revealed that the pharmacy test wasn't her only proof. For weeks, she had been secretly filming the kitchen with a hidden camera I never even knew existed. As Jessica's voice began to fade, she whispered one final phrase that turned my blood to ice. "Check the stove, Thane. They've already started the next phase." I ripped the headphones off, my eyes snapping instantly toward the kitchen stove. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I didn't just walk toward the stove. I lunged for it, my hand shaking uncontrollably as I reached for the knobs that should have been ice cold. The air in the kitchen was thick with the faint, rotten egg smell of natural gas, an odor that shouldn't have been there since I finished my tea hours ago. My heart hammered like a trapped bird against my ribs when I discovered the valve, for the back burner, was turned wide open with no blue flame flickering. I twisted the knob shut, the the sudden silence of the house feeling predatorily loud. This wasn't a simple mistake. Looking closer, I noticed a linen dish towel placed dangerously close to the pilot light. It was a deliberate attempt at arson, designed to look like old age forgetfulness. Someone had slipped into my home while I was at the repair shop, moving through my life with the clinical precision of a butcher. I threw the kitchen window open, letting the crisp, damp November air rush in to clear the poison from the room. "You wanted to clear the evidence, didn't you, Silas?" I whispered to the empty room. "Not tonight. Not while I'm still standing." I stood there in the darkness, my mind sharper and clearer than it had ever been. A clarity that only comes when you realize the people you love have become your executioners. By dawn, the headlights of a luxury SUV cut through the morning mist, sweeping across the kitchen walls like a searchlight. Silas Garrison, my 45-year-old oldest son who had long since traded farm work for the hollow promises of a Silicon Forest startup, stood in the kitchen doorway. He looked at me with a practiced mask of pitying concern. Behind him was Leone Ross, a 42-year-old hedge fund manager, her designer heels clicking sharply against the farmhouse hardwood floors. She stepped into the room with a smile that never quite reached her cold, amber eyes. Silas slammed a box of voodoo donuts onto the counter, the sound echoing like a gavel in the quiet room. The sickeningly sweet smell of frosted dough immediately fought with the lingering scent of gas. Silas stepped toward me, his voice dripping with a fake sweetness that made my skin crawl. He told me how worried they had been when I didn't answer my phone last night. But I watched his eyes dart instantly toward the stove, checking for the results of his handiwork. "Good morning, Thane," Leone chirped, her voice as sharp as her jewelry. "You smell a bit like gas, dear. Are you sure you're feeling all right? How do you fight back when your enemies are digging your professional grave while smiling right to your face?" I sat at the kitchen table, feeling cornered in my own home. Leone accidentally discovered a scorched piece of cloth near the stove, where I knew for a fact nothing had been just minutes earlier. She let out a practiced sigh of clinical sympathy, exchanging a dark look with my son. "Silas, look at this," she said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. The stove was left on again. My son leaned over, sweat breaking out on his forehead despite the morning chill. He told me they couldn't keep living in fear that the house would catch fire while I was asleep. I watched them play off each other, a perfectly choreographed performance of concern, designed to strip away my land and my life. Leone reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a glossy brochure for the Riverside Care Center, her voice dropping to a whisper. "We've already put down a deposit, Thane. It's for your own safety." She revealed that she had already scheduled an appointment with a specialist for me this very afternoon. I looked at the brochure, then at Silas's sweating forehead, realizing that the only way to beat a shark is to make it think you're already bait. I stared at the glossy photos of smiling seniors on the brochure, letting my hands tremble just enough to satisfy the expectations of the two predators sitting at my breakfast table. The slick, chemical texture of the paper felt like a warning against my skin. But I kept my gaze low, presenting a hollowed-out version of myself. I put on the performance of a lifetime, tracing a manicured courtyard image with a confused finger. "Is it close to the farm, Leone?" I asked, my voice weak and cracking at the edges. "My hazelnuts are ripening soon, and I need to be here for the harvest." "It's just down the road, Thane," she cooed, her sharp perfume hanging in the air like a heavy shroud. But you won't need to worry about those trees anymore. Silas is going to take that burden off your shoulders. I watched her body language from beneath my brow. She leaned in with a predatory grace, describing the amenities of the lockdown facility as if she were selling a luxury spa. In reality, she was describing my cell, a place where doors only opened with a code I wouldn't have. Silas nodded along, his eyes darting toward the hallway where I had left my coat earlier. Leon's chair scraped against the floor, a sound like a knife on bone that signaled a shift in the air. Believing they had successfully broken my will, the two began to speak as if I were as invisible as the wallpaper. They discussed neighboring interests, my ears catching a sharp mention of the energy company's state permit deadline. Silas whispered about land titles, insisting they needed me to sign over power of attorney today to close the deal by Friday. Craxo. That was when I learned Leon wasn't just trying to liquidate my life for a quick payout. She had a side deal with a drilling company that would bypass environmental reviews if I were declared legally incapacitated. "He's too tired to fight us, Silas," she muttered, the fake warmth entirely gone from her voice. "Look at him." Their benevolence was a velvet shroud, soft to the touch, but designed to suffocate every right I had to this land. As they turned to leave, Silas made a show of straightening up the kitchen, but I watched his hand slip into a small ceramic bowl by the door. I heard the faint clink of the brass key to the external storage room disappear into his pocket. "We'll see you tomorrow, Dad," he said, patting my shoulder with a hand that felt like lead. "Get some rest. You seem confused." I forced a hollow smile, whispering that I'd be right here, that I wasn't going anywhere. The moment their SUV crunched over the gravel driveway and faded from sight, my mask dropped instantly. Feeling a cold surge of adrenaline, I bolted toward the study to verify my defenses. I yanked open the bottom drawer of the desk where documents were kept, only to find an empty space that echoed back at me. My passport was gone, stolen by my own son, to ensure I couldn't flee before the Monday admission. My breath hitched as I realized the theft went much deeper. I reached behind the loose paneling where I had hidden the e-reader, but my fingers met only cold, empty air. I didn't let panic take over. I took a deep breath, scanning the room for the one thing they couldn't possibly know I possessed. My fingers clawed at the base of the desk where the device, my only connection to Jessica's truth, should have been, finding nothing but cold air. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull thudding in the oppressive silence of the study. Then I remembered. I had intentionally left a cheap, broken tablet from the junk drawer out in plain sight as bait. The vultures were too efficient for their own good. They had snatched up the shiny glass decoy, completely missing the real e-reader, which was taped securely behind the heavy oak bookshelf. Retrieving the real device with trembling hands, I felt a small, sharp victory over my own flesh and blood. Silas never did pay attention to the details, always looking for the fastest score. I whispered to the shadows that I still had her, and I was still listening. To ensure no hidden microphones could capture my reaction, I retreated to the soundproof workshop in the basement. The air down there smelled of damp earth and old grease. A familiar, honest scent that Leon's perfume couldn't touch. I sat at my rough, unfinished cedar workbench, cold sweat dripping down my spine, and activated file number 2. The quality of this recording was high, likely captured while Leon and Silas were walking through the hazelnut orchard, completely unaware that Jessica had left her device nearby in a garden basket. Leon's voice carried a high, metallic pitch that set my teeth on edge. She talked about the hydraulic fracturing potential of my eastern 50 acres, claiming the deal would cover up a recent embezzlement scandal at her firm. I had to pause the audio. My stomach turned, and the taste of the pastries Leon had brought turned to ashes in my mouth. I leaned over the workbench, the wood grain blurring before my eyes. The wood grain blurring before. How much is a father worth to a son who only sees dollar signs in the setting sun? I forced myself to press play again. Silas sounded pathetic, begging like a small-time criminal for a larger cut to pay off his gambling debts. Leon brushed him off, stating that as soon as the old man was safely tucked away at Riverside, they would sign the easement agreement. She pointed out that the energy company wouldn't care about the accidents that led to my admission. Silas asked if I was truly that confused, or if they were just making sure I stayed that way. The recording revealed a brutal timeline. There were exactly 5 days left until the state's natural gas auction. Leon mentioned that the supplements were only the first phase. Riverside was where they would finish the job, by ensuring my heart gave out under the stress of what they called dementia-related agitation. I stared at the concrete walls of the basement, the blue glow of the e-reader the only visible thing in the darkness. "He's 70, Silas," she said, her voice completely devoid of human warmth. "Men his age have strokes every day. It's expected." Sitting there in the dark, I realized my son wasn't just stealing the land I'd spent 40 years tending. He was participating in my death sentence. "I will never be an empty house, Leon," I thought with cold, murderous resolve. "I'm the one who planted these trees." The recording at the end of the file introduced a third voice, one I recognized instantly, causing the e-reader to slip through my numb fingers. The basement was dead silent, but my brain was screaming. That third voice shouldn't have been there. My son's voice was a knife, but the third voice on that recording was the whetstone that sharpened it. It was the dry, cold voice of Arthur Vance, our family's financial advisor for years. For 30 years, every harvest season, every investment, I entrusted the fruits of my labor to that man. Now, hearing him discuss liquidating my life's assets with Leon felt like a physical violation. I sat in the dark of the workshop, replaying those whispers over and over. They weren't just planning a sale, they were dismantling the fabric of my existence. That was when I realized the conspiracy wasn't limited to a single rotten branch on my family tree. It was the whole orchard. Terrified that the farmhouse might be bugged, I didn't dare turn on the lights. I packed a small bag with a few essentials, and that precious e-reader, my heart hammering wildly against my ribs. I couldn't risk triggering the front door cameras. I slipped out the back door, my boots sinking into the familiar hazelnut soil as I navigated through the orchard in the pre-dawn shadows. "Not you, Arthur," I whispered to the cold wind. "Not after everything we built together." I walked to my truck, hidden near the old barn, and began the long, paranoid drive to Portland. When I arrived at Alaric Benedict's 8th-floor office, I looked like a shipwreck survivor, orchard mud still clinging to my heels. Alaric Benedict, a 65-year-old attorney with a mane of silver hair, was known in the Portland legal community as the most ethical shark in town. He stood up when I walked in. Asking no questions, he welcomed me into his sanctuary, which smelled of old leather and premium espresso. Silence. Portland traffic hummed 8 floors below. But in that office, as I played the first 3 minutes of File 2, the air felt as thin as a vacuum. I watched the color drain from Alaric's face as Leon's sharp voice filled the room. Alaric, I said, my own voice shaking with suppressed fury. They aren't waiting for me to die. They're making sure I do. He took a long, slow breath and told me we needed to examine everything Jessica left behind. He pulled up a recent filing on the county clerk's digital portal, something I didn't even know existed. My eyes burned as I stared at the cold blue light of his monitor. He showed me a restructured will, dated just 2 weeks before Jessica died. The signature was a masterpiece, but I knew it was a lie. How many times had I held that boy's hand while he hid a forged blade behind his back? Jessica had a slight tremor from Parkinson's, a detail the forger missed. The pen strokes were far too steady. The document granted Silas immediate power of attorney and ownership of the farm the moment I was deemed incompetent. Alaric's pen scratched across his notepad, sounding like grinding teeth in the quiet office. He told me the court didn't know it was a forgery yet, but there was more. Silas hadn't just forged the will. He had already used it as collateral to secure a massive bridge loan against the farm's equity. Alaric leaned back, his eyes darkening with a fresh, horrifying discovery. "Thane," he said, his voice dropping low. "If they've already taken the loan, they don't just need you at Riverside. They need you gone completely before the first payment is due." The implication of Alaric's words hit me harder than the forgery itself. The drive back to the Willamette Valley felt like descending into a grave I had helped dig with my own silence. My old truck creaking through the evening fog that wrapped tightly around the hazelnut trees. I returned home at dusk. The farmhouse, looking like an empty ribcage under the gray Oregon sky, stripped of the warmth Jessica used to provide. I didn't enter through the kitchen. I couldn't bear to look at the stove where they had tried to stage my final descent into Bentacha. Instead, I bypassed the main floor entirely and retreated back to the soundproof workshop in the basement. The air down there smelled of damp concrete and motor oil, a familiar, honest scent that usually brought me peace, but today it only felt freezing. My hands shook as I navigated the e-reader's interface, my fingers clumsy against the cold glass. "I'm still here, Jessica," I whispered to the shadows. "I'm still listening. They won't take this land as long as I have breath in my body." Leone wasn't just paying for high-end care at Riverside. She was also paying Linda, the head nurse, a 15% kickback from the fracking millions to facilitate my medical erasure. I played File 3, a secret recording of a phone call Leone made on our porch, likely while I was supposed to be napping. Linda's clinical, sharp tone on the recording made my skin crawl as she bargained over the price of my sanity. "I need him uncommunicative." Leone's voice cut through the static with a chilling indifference. "He's bound to show agitation when the doors close, and I want him heavily sedated." A branch slapped against the basement window, sounding like a hand trying to claw its way into my sanctuary. I nearly dropped the device, my heart hammering like a mallet against my ribs. "For that 15%, Linda replied, her greed clear even through the low bitrate audio. "I'll make sure he doesn't even remember his own name, let alone a hazelnut tree." How much does a man's soul weigh when it's traded for drilling rights in a Portland boardroom? The audio continued, with Leone confirming a Monday morning check-in date. She mentioned that the first bridge loan payment was due on the 15th, and she needed me medically incapacitated before then to close the deed transfer without resistance. Staring at the gray concrete wall, I realized Riverside wasn't a care facility at all. It was a processing center for my disappearance. Monday was a point of no return. I had spent 70 years building a life, tending this land, only for my own flesh and blood to treat me like an inconvenience to be erased for a ledger entry. In the background of the audio, I heard a rhythmic, repetitive scraping. It was the sound of a pen scratching against paper. I realized with horror that Silas was right next to her, practicing my signature over and over, perfecting his forgery for the final transfer documents. I shut off the e-reader, my mind racing through the 3 days I had left before a chemical fog consumed me. Suddenly, the basement silence shattered. I heard heavy, familiar bootsteps on the floorboards directly above me, a vibration that rattled the tools on my workbench. Someone was in the house. I pressed my back hard against the cold concrete wall, clutching the e-reader to my chest as the basement door creaked open, throwing a beam of light down the stairs like a prison yard searchlight. The heavy, familiar footsteps upstairs had been a warning. Now, the rhythmic groaning of the stairs told me the predator was descending into my sanctuary. I stood perfectly still, a shadow within shadows, watching Silas walk into the workshop. He didn't turn on the overhead lights, using instead the narrow, yellow beam of a high-powered flashlight to sweep across my cedar workbench and tool racks. That was when I realized my son wasn't just checking to see if I was home. He was hunting. "Where did you put it, you old fool?" he muttered, a greedy desperation in his voice that made my scalp tingle. He tossed aside a stack of old blueprints, clearly searching for the e-reader he thought he'd secured with Leon. I realized they knew Jessica had recorded their actions, and they were terrified of what they had left behind. That realization crystallized my remaining hesitation into a diamond of cold, hard resolve. Silas finally kicked a wooden stool in frustration, complaining that it wouldn't matter what I remembered in 2 days anyway. When he retreated upstairs and the door clicked shut, the silence that returned was different. It was no longer the silence of a victim, but the calm of a man preparing for a harvest that was long overdue. Have you ever walked into a lion's den just to find a spear? I went back to the workbench. The blue light of the e-reader, illuminating my calloused hands as I replayed a specific segment of Jessica's recording. She had mentioned a master key hidden within Riverside's digital patient logs, evidence of the bribes and fatal sedation routines Linda used on others. I understood now that I couldn't win this battle by running to Portland again. To secure the evidence needed for murder charges, I had to walk directly into the trap. "You want to put me in a cage, Silas? Fine, but I'm coming inside with the key. I'm coming for you, Linda." I spent the rest of the night preparing tactically with a feverish intensity. Using my best watchmaking tools, I hollowed out an old hearing aid, retrofitting a highly sensitive digital recorder inside its casing. My anger was a whetstone, and I was sharpening myself into a blade they would never see coming. I packed my suitcase with deliberate clumsiness, exactly as they expected. Mismatched wool socks, old faded photos of the orchard, and a stained cardigan. Hidden within the lining, however, were the tools of my new trade. As the gray, freezing Oregon morning light began to bleed through the bedroom window, I stood before the mirror, practicing the vacant, drifting stare of a man whose mind was a sieve. "Watch me, Jessica. I'm the best actor in this valley. Monday is the finish line for all of us." I picked up the phone, and though I forced my voice to carry the frail tremor required by the script, my fingers were rock steady. I called Silas, letting the silence hang for a beat when he answered before speaking. "Son," I said, sounding like a man lost on his own porch, I think I'm ready to go to Riverside now. Silas's voice carried a mix of surprise and greedy relief when I told him I was ready for Riverside. I hung up, the kitchen silence pressing down on me, but it didn't last long. The phone didn't just ring, it screamed against the kitchen tile, the caller ID flashing a name that made my heart skip a beat. Dr. Briar Garrison. I stared at the vibrating device, my chest tightening against the gray morning light coming through the window. Briar was my middle child, a 40-year-old pediatric cardiologist who wore exhaustion like a second skin. When I answered, her voice was a masterclass in professional detachment. That hollow, clinical tone she surely used on the hospital wards. "Dad, Silas sent me some concerning logs," she began, bypassing any warm greeting. "He mentioned fluctuations in your neurological state and some troubling behavior near the stove." I gripped the edge of the counter, the smell of yesterday morning's cold, stale coffee hitting me. "I'm just tired, Briar," I said, forcing a weary rasp into my throat. "This big house, it's just too quiet." My mind raced, realizing how deep this trap went. Silas hadn't just been gaslighting me. He'd been sending medical journals and fabricated logs of my alleged memory slips to Briar for weeks. He was using my daughter's own expertise to build a clinical case to justify my confinement. She began using medical jargon, executive function, cognitive units, neurodecline, making me feel like a specimen under a microscope rather than a father. How do you tell your own daughter that the brother she grew up with is counting the minutes until his father's heart stops beating? I had seconds to decide whether to scream the truth or guide her to discover it herself. I chose the latter. "Silas is very thorough, isn't he?" I mused, letting a sliver of bitterness slip through the act. "He's always been good at organizing things." Her voice was as sharp and sterile as a scalpel, cutting through the memory of the little girl who used to follow me through the orchard. She told me Silas was worried for my safety and that Riverside had a top-tier care unit. It was a diagnostic snare set by one sibling and triggered by another out of a misplaced sense of duty. I dropped the vacant act slightly, letting myself sound lucid, even a bit desperate. "Briar, come to the farm tomorrow morning," I pleaded. "Just you. No Silas, no Leon. I found some of your mother's things, something only you would understand." I could feel her hesitation, the doctor conflicting with the daughter, who still remembered the smell of the hazelnut harvest. She went quiet for a moment, and I could hear her clinical mask cracking as she whispered, "Dad, Silas said you were dangerous. Are you dangerous?" I closed my eyes. The weight of the e-reader in my pocket, feeling heavier than the house itself. Briar went on to admit something that turned my blood cold. Silas had already had her sign a medical affidavit supporting my involuntary commitment. He wanted the legal shackles locked before I even reached the facility gates. "I'll be there, Dad," she finally said, her voice small. "Tomorrow morning." I hung up, my hands shaking as I looked out at the hazelnut trees, knowing I had exactly 24 hours to prove I wasn't the monster Silas had described. When the heavy magnetic locks at Riverside Memory Care clicked shut behind me, sounding like a prison door finalizing a life sentence, I adjusted my hearing aid, the one that wasn't meant for hearing at all. The lobby was sunlit and immaculate, smelling of lemon bleach and floor wax. A manufactured paradise designed to soothe the guilt of the living. Silas stood beside me, his impatient greed radiating off him like heat from a wood stove. We were greeted by Linda, the 55-year-old head nurse, whose smile was as sharp as a scalpel and whose voice sounded like silk rubbed over sandpaper. She offered a sugary welcome, treating me with the condescending tenderness one might reserve for a 5-year-old. I immediately noticed the contrast between her practiced warmth and the clinical coldness in her eyes. Silas told her I'd been having frequent episodes and that it was best to start the stabilization protocol right away. Linda then revealed she was far more than a dedicated nurse. She mentioned her direct financial interest in the drilling company through a shell corporation, effectively making her a primary stakeholder in my disappearance. The safety protocols she spoke of were nothing more than restrictions on my autonomy. I felt the hidden recorder in my ear catching every word. Linda led us into the locked memory care wing, a world of white walls and the unsettling, gentle hum of the building's ventilation system. The artificial brightness of the fluorescent lights made the vacant, drifting stares of the patients in the hallway look even more tragic. They stared into nothingness, their spirits clearly suppressed by chemical restraints. A patient down the hall dropped a cup of water, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sterile quiet. Goosebumps broke out across my arms as I watched a woman reach out for a hand that wasn't there. Linda discussed my agitated nature openly with Silas, explaining that they used a very specific cocktail of medication for patients with my level of resistance. Silas asked if it was safe, adding that he needed me to sign a few documents before I settled in. There wasn't even a shadow of the sun I raised in his voice. How many lives had been traded for dividends in this shiny, carpeted mausoleum? We entered my assigned room, a beautiful cage, with furniture bolted to the floor and a window that only opened an inch. Linda slipped a business card into Silas's hand, with the extra service fee they had discussed written across it. She told him she'd have the paperwork ready by Monday, as long as the consulting fee was cleared first. She looked at me and said the view was beautiful and that I'd never want to leave. That was when I realized I had captured enough audio of their conspiracy to burn the whole place down, but a new fear hit me. As we passed the on-site pharmacy, I saw the order chart for my stabilization blend. It was a medication specifically designed to mimic the stroke symptoms that killed Jessica. A chemical execution waiting for me in a small plastic cup. As we walked back to the car, Silas patted my shoulder, his hand feeling like a piece of cold, dead meat. He told me Monday would be the start of my brand new life. The scent of leather and lies filled Silas's Lexus as we pulled away from the curb. I slumped against the cold leather headrest in the back seat, letting my jaw slacken and my breathing go shallow, turning myself into the harmless shell they wanted. To them, I was already a ghost, a remnant whose only remaining value was a signature. Silas pushed the car onto Highway 99 West, the rhythmic hum of the tires on the interstate creating a hypnotic pulse that masked the mechanical buzz of my modified hearing aid. Believing I was completely checked out, Leone chewed a piece of peppermint gum and leaned toward the driver's seat. She let out a sharp, brittle laugh, noting that the facility had completely broken my spirit. She revealed she had been intercepting Breyer's calls to the farm for weeks, ensuring our doctor-daughter received only a curated ledger of my supposed episodes. Silas gripped the wheel, the orange glow of the setting sun reflecting off the dashboard and into his eyes. He asked if Breyer would truly hold the line, and Leone assured him that no court in Oregon would touch them if a cardiologist signed off on the symptoms. Silas honked at a stray deer, the sound echoing like a knell inside my skull, but I didn't flinch. My performance remained flawless, as Leone detailed the final logistics of the natural gas lease. The drilling rigs were positioned 3 miles out, waiting for the legal gates to open. She spoke of my Jessica with a casual cruelty, commenting that she could have saved herself the suffering if she hadn't been so stubborn about the sale. I felt a cold rage when Silas failed to defend his mother's memory. Instead, he agreed that the farm was a wasted legacy and that they were finally putting the land to use. "Do you feel guilty about Mom, Silas?" he asked, his voice sounding temporarily thin. Leone's answer was the whetstone to my anger. She said she felt it was a shame Jessica had been so difficult. They were simply finishing what she wouldn't start. How do you quantify the cost of a son's soul when it's traded for a lease agreement? The sun had dropped below the horizon when we reached the farm, leaving the house in a tomb of shadows. Silas helped me stumble into the foyer, his touch a sickening display of false care. The moment the SUV's taillights vanished down the driveway, I stood up straight, the fatigue vanishing under tactical necessity. I pulled the recorder from my ear, my fingers trembling with cold triumph. Connecting the device's cold metallic interface to the e-reader's charging port, I watched the blue sync bar light up. I uploaded the entire in-car confession to the secure cloud drive Alaric had established, ensuring the truth was out of their reach, even if I didn't survive the weekend. I discovered through Leone's earlier whispers that the consulting fee Silas mentioned was actually a bribe to the county coroner to ensure a full autopsy was never performed on my wife. "You just signed your own death warrant, Silas," I thought, staring at the screen. I watched the blinking upload icon turn into a steady notification. Upload complete. I stared at the glowing rectangle in the dark kitchen, realizing I hadn't yet listened to the single file Jessica had labeled with only my name. The kitchen became a tomb of shadows, the only light source being the glowing rectangle of the e-reader in my hand. I didn't stay there. I retreated to the soundproof workshop in the basement, the only place where the air still felt honest despite the cold. The e-reader screen glowed like a radioactive ember in the basement shadows, mocking me with the one file I had been too terrified to open, the one Jessica had named the pawn. I sat at the workbench, the flickering, dying fluorescent bulb overhead throwing nervous shadows across my tools. My hands shook as I navigated the interface. I found myself whispering to the empty room, begging my wife's memory. "Please, Jessica, don't let him be a part of this. I'm sorry, I wasn't there to see the wolf in the flock." I thought of Beckett Garrison, my 35-year-old youngest son, whose eyes still carried the trembling light of early recovery. I recalled his history with addiction, and how Silas had always played the hero who bailed him out. I finally pressed play. The audio opened with a heavy hiss of static, the background filled with the faint smell of diesel and the sound of old hay. The farm's old tractor shed. I quickly discovered that Silas had targeted Beckett specifically for dark web transactions, knowing Beckett's prior record would make him the perfect scapegoat if the poison were ever discovered. Silas's voice was low and predatory, as he reminded Beckett about a $10,000 debt from his past, a debt Silas claimed to have quietly wiped clean for him. Silas instructed a visibly nervous Beckett to use his old online contacts to order herbal supplements for their mother. He framed it as a secret way to bypass my stubborn refusal of modern medicine, weaponizing Beckett's desperate desire to help Jessica. I squeezed the e-reader so hard I thought the plastic would shatter right along with my heart. "It's just herbal supplements, Beck." Silas's deep, confident voice vibrated through the speaker. "Dad is too old-fashioned to understand. Do you want Mom to keep suffering?" "I don't know," Beckett replied, his voice heavy with the pathetic, desperate gratitude of someone who thought he'd been saved. The last time I ordered stuff like this online, it blew up into my face. The recording captured Silas handing him a prepaid crypto card and a specific list of vendors. He assured Beckett this would clear his slate and make him the family savior. "You're going to be the hero here, Beck," Silas urged. "Just go home and order the blue supplements. Jessica needs them." My eyes stung with tears as the realization hit me. Silas hadn't just ended my wife's life. He had used his own brother's past trauma as the weapon to do it. How could a man share the same blood as the brother he was actively setting up to take the fall? The final few seconds of the recording were the cruelest. Silas brought up the debt one last time, but as Beckett walked away, his tone completely shifted. In a whispered aside to himself, Silas revealed he had never actually bailed Beckett out. Years ago, Silas was the anonymous tipster who called the police on Beckett's past troubles, intentionally manufacturing the debt in the first place. He had engineered Beckett's downfall years ago just to have a compliant tool ready for this exact moment. I turned off the device, the silence of the basement, suddenly feeling heavier than the dirt above it. I knew there was one more person I needed to face before Briar arrived in the morning. Silas hadn't just taken a life. He was trying to bury both of his siblings under the weight of his own greed. I didn't wait for dawn. I climbed the basement stairs, my legs heavy, but my purpose crystal clear. The house was dead quiet, but every floorboard seemed to scream with the betrayal I had just uncovered. Standing on the porch, I watched the first light of dawn bleed across the hazelnut trees like a bruise, catching the reflection of a silver SUV rolling up the long gravel driveway. It was my daughter, the one with the stethoscope and the clinical detachment. Briar arrived at the farm to the sharp crunch of gravel, a sound that felt like a countdown. She stepped out of her car in her medical scrubs, the sterile scent of the hospital still clinging to her like protective armor. She didn't reach out for a hug. Instead, she greeted me with a steady, diagnostic gaze, checking my pupils and the stability of my stride, as if I were a specimen in a lab. "You look exhausted, Dad," she said, her voice stripped of any daughterly warmth. "Silas told me your coordination was off yesterday." I leaned against the porch railing, feeling the damp morning mist against my neck. "Silas says a lot of things, Briar. Come on inside. The coffee's fresh." Once we crossed the threshold, she revealed she wasn't just here for a casual wellness check. She reached into her bag and pulled out the involuntary commitment paperwork that Silas had already pre-signed, intending to force me into Riverside today, if I showed even a single hint of instability. The clinical precision of the ambush made my stomach turn. I led her into the kitchen, where the air was rich with the scent of the dark roast I'd brewed, just to keep my hands from shaking. I refused to play along with her memory tests or the practiced medical small talk she used to keep her distance. Briar's medical bag hit the floor with a heavy thud, the stethoscope clinking like chains in the sterile quiet of the room. I maintained a stoic, almost unsettling silence, forcing her to stop her interrogation. "I'm not here to play doctor and patient, Briar," I said, my voice low and commanding. "I'm here to be your father." I placed the e-reader and the heavy, cold, noise-canceling headphones onto the scarred oak table. I motioned for her to sit in the very chair where Jessica used to write her journals. "Just listen," I ordered. "Don't say a word until the file is done." She let out a weary, skeptical sigh and put on the headphones. Her posture radiated the belief that she was simply humoring the ramblings of a grieving, confused mind. How many years of medical school?" does it take to lose the ability to recognize your own mother's voice, holding your sibling accountable? I watched her face closely as the first audio file began to play. I saw the exact moment her professional mask cracked. Her eyes widened subtly as she heard Jessica's voice describing the specific, lethal effects of high-dose warfarin. "Wait, that's Mom," she whispered, her hand trembling as she reached for the volume control. "Listen to the science, Briar," I told her. "You're the cardiologist." She looked out the window, her eyes darting around as if searching for an exit. But I had an ally she didn't know about. I had Beckett keeping watch on the back of the house from the old barn, making sure Silas hadn't followed her to the farm to interrupt this moment. Briar's hand flew over her mouth, her face turning a ghostly, clinical white, as Jessica whispered through the recording. "Briar, if you're hearing this, it's because Silas thinks you're just as blind as your father." The kitchen clock ticked away like a countdown as I watched my daughter turn back into a doctor. But this time, the patient was her own soul. I watched my daughter's clinical mask shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces, the cardiologist replaced by a terrified child who had just heard her mother's final testament. Briar ripped the headphones off, her hands shaking so violently she nearly knocked over her cold coffee. She began to hyperventilate, completely forgetting the biting chill of the kitchen floor, as her medical brain automatically cross-referenced the symptoms Jessica had described: the bruising, the dizziness, the metallic taste. With chronic warfarin toxicity, that was the moment she realized. Silas had been sending her falsified blood work from a private lab for months, masking the poison as a natural decline in health. "I missed it, Dad," she choked out, her voice a raw, terrified whisper. I looked at the charts Silas gave me instead of looking at my own mother. High-dose warfarin. It perfectly mimics a hemorrhagic stroke. He knew exactly what he was doing. I sat in silence, letting the weight of her realization settle before showing her the forged will and the financial logs I'd uncovered with Alaric. Briar stared at the digital screen, the forged signatures illuminating the dark reality of our situation. She realized Silas didn't just want the land. He wanted to eliminate anyone who could question his claim to it. She recalled the phone calls where Silas had subtly guided her away from visiting, understanding now that it was a coordinated campaign of isolation. A subtle snap echoed through the quiet room as Briar's fingers gripped her ceramic mug so tightly, a hairline fracture split the clay, mirroring the collapse inside her world. The realization that her brother had used her medical license as a shield for his actions turned her grief into a cold, focused fury. "He used me, Dad," she said, her eyes now burning with rising anger. "He used my title to lock you into his narrative. Silas didn't just kill her. He made us accomplices in his silence." I watched her transformation, the clinical mask completely replaced by a warrior's resolve. Can a house built on 40 years of love survive a flood of absolute premeditated malice? I believed it could, provided we were willing to fight, just as dirty as the vultures circling us. Briar stood up, clutching her medical bag like a weapon. She agreed to join my countertrap, promising to use her position as a doctor to guide Silas into a false sense of security. We began planning Sunday night's family dinner, where she would pretend to be the one executing the Riverside commitment plan. "I'm going to make him feel safe, Dad," she promised, her voice like strategic steel. "I'll be the doctor he expects." "We're not just stopping them, Briar," I reminded her, as a truck rumbled past the house in the distance, carrying the omen of our mission. We're going to dismantle them. She went on to reveal she had access to Silas's private medical portal and could see he was already researching hospice care for me. Confirming Monday was indeed intended to be my final sunset. Briar locked eyes with me, her medical bag gripped tight. He wants a doctor to sign those papers tomorrow, Dad. I'm going to give him exactly what he wants. This plan was no longer just about justice. It was about survival. The farmhouse no longer just had walls. It had grown eyes, tiny, unblinking lenses, hidden behind family portraits and inside the hollowed-out spine of Jessica's favorite book. At dusk, Alaric Benedict arrived with Corbin Mercer and a specialized technical team disguised as plumbers. They moved through the hallways with military precision, the metallic scent of wire strippers and solder quickly mixing with the smell of old wood. I watched Corbin open a panel behind my wedding photo, his fingers deftly threading fiber optic cameras into the drywall. I realized the team of plumbers Alaric hired was actually made up of off-duty state investigators, men whose presence ensured the chain of custody for every pixel of digital evidence would remain unbroken. My sanctuary was being converted into a high-stakes sting operation, a cold necessity that felt like peeling back my own skin. "Corbin," I whispered, watching the ghostly blue light of his laptop as he tested the feeds. "Make sure the audio is crystal clear. I need to capture every breath of Silas's greed." He didn't look up, just gave a firm nod, assuring me that the moment they started talking, they were finished. In the dining room, Briar was rehearsing her role with Alaric. I stood in the doorway, observing my daughter's transformation into a double agent. She was practicing the cold, detached tone a physician uses when handing a parent over to state care. Her face was a mask of professional resignation that made my heart ache. She helped place microphones inside the centerpiece on the dining table, positioning them exactly where Silas and Leon would most likely lean in to speak about their fracturing millions. "I have to sound like I've given up on you, Dad," she said, her voice cracking briefly. "It's the only way to keep him off guard." A tiny red LED light pulsed on the smoke detector, a small eye looking down from above. It was a silent witness to the burden we now shared, a professional resolve that felt as heavy as the house itself. With the team finally hidden away in the basement, I sat in the kitchen as the flickering shadows of the hazelnut trees danced against the window. I picked up the phone, my fingers steady, despite the lie I was about to tell my own flesh and blood. I called Silas, adopting the trembling, submissive voice of a man finally broken under the weight of his own alleged mental decline. "Son, I think I'm ready," I said, letting a faint wobble slip into my words. "I don't want to be a burden anymore. I think Monday is the right choice." Silas didn't hesitate for a second. His voice on the other end was a greedy chuckle, breathless with relief. "It's the right call, Dad," he replied. "It's the right call, Dad. Leon has the paperwork ready. We'll be there Sunday at 6. Have you ever invited your own executioners to dinner? Just to see the look on their faces when the noose snaps." During the call, Silas mentioned almost casually that they had already sold my old truck to a local wholesaler, proving they viewed the farm's transfer as a done deal. He framed it as a way to ensure I'd never need to leave anyway. I hung up the phone and looked at Briar, my voice returning to its true, iron coldness as the investigators in the basement signaled a successful recording. "They're coming," I told her, my eyes locked on the driveway, "and they're bringing the devil with them." The farmhouse grew quiet after the technical team retreated to the basement, but the silence felt like a tightly wound spring. I walked toward my bedroom, my movements slow, my steps heavy, on the fir floors that had supported me for 42 years. The house felt like an empty skull, but in the quiet of my room, the scent of Jessica's lavender sachets still lingered, a ghostly reminder of the woman I was doing this for. I sat on the edge of the bed we shared, feeling the softness of the worn quilt beneath my calloused palms. I avoided the downstairs, where the investigators and Corbin were huddled around monitors. Before the final performance began, I needed a moment of true connection. I picked up the e-reader, my thumb hovering over the file marked simply, "For Thane, my love." That was the moment I discovered Jessica had known she was running out of time, months before the stroke finally took her life. She had spent that final season intentionally setting up this digital device as her final witness, knowing the vultures would overlook a simple tablet in search of larger assets. "One more time, Jessica," I whispered to the empty air. "Let me hear your voice. One more time. I'm not ready to say goodbye, but I'm ready to fight." I pressed play, and her voice filled the room, soft and intimate, stripped of the clinical distance found in the earlier surveillance logs. Unlike the rough audio from the tractor shed, this recording carried a tragic, haunting beauty. She didn't talk about poison or deeds. She talked about the morning mist over the orchard and the way I looked at her when we planted the first oak tree decades ago. The audio cut out for a second, a terrifying heartbeat where I thought I'd lost her forever. But then her breathing returned to the speaker. "Find me in the trees, Thane," she said, a warm rasp in her voice that tightened my chest. "Every time the wind moves the leaves, that's me telling you I'm proud of you. You've always been the strong one. Don't let their lies make you feel small. How can a few megabytes of data carry the weight of a 42-year marriage?" Listening to her words gave me the permission to be the man she knew. The one who protects the truth even when the world is burning down around him. The recording ended with a plea to save Beckett, knowing he was being manipulated by Silas's cruelty. She told me justice was a harvest that takes time, and I had to be the one to gather it. I closed my eyes, the rhythmic ticking of the bedside clock marking the arrival of dawn. A cold, crystalline resolve settled into my chest, stronger than any grief. I realized I was no longer just a victim or an insider in this script. I was the keeper of her legacy, and tomorrow I would be the storm that clears the valley. "I hear you, Jessica," I said, my tears finally stopping. "I'm going to save our son, and I'm going to bury the wolves." As I turned the device over in my hands, I noticed a subtle seam I hadn't seen before. I discovered a hand-drawn map hidden within the e-reader's protective casing, marking the exact placement of where the surveillance equipment focused in the orchard. I tucked the e-reader beneath my pillow, the blue glow fading as the first gray light hit the horizon. "Good morning, Silas," I whispered to the dark. "It's time to sign your own death warrant." The morning of the reckoning arrived with a deceptive calm. I stood before the hallway mirror, intentionally buttoning my cardigan unevenly, watching the stranger in the glass, with the vacant eyes and slack jaw. A perfect, pathetic piece of bait. The scratchy wool was my costume. The mismatched buttons, my armor. I walked to the kitchen and left a half-eaten piece of cold toast on the counter. A small detail designed to mimic a mind that forgot it had even eaten breakfast. I didn't even brush my hair, letting the silver strands stand up in uneven patches. I checked the hidden monitor, hidden behind the cereal boxes in the pantry. Seeing Corbin's green light signal that the network was live, broadcasting every shadow directly to Alaric's remote server. I adjusted the device in my left ear before reaching for the right. I had 2 hearing aids now. The other didn't record, but allowed me to hear the live commentary from the technical team in the basement. It was my direct line to the men who would eventually be Silas's jailers. They wanted a victim, I whispered to my reflection. I'm going to give them a masterpiece. Checkmate begins with the first move of the pawn. I walked through the living room, touching the grain of the furniture and the edges of the picture frames. Jessica loved. I paused before her favorite armchair, the place where she used to spend her afternoons reading, until the tremors in her hands became too much to bear. A sudden, warm breeze brushed against my cheek, a ghostly sensation of her presence that gave me the strength to endure the upcoming humiliation. It felt as though she were standing right there, leaning in to offer a blessing before the storm broke. I'm doing this for our boys, Jessica, I thought, my mind filled with a bitter resolve. And for this land, hold on tight. I'm going to need you when the shouting starts. I don't remember. I prepared to speak today would be a nail in the legal coffin Silas was building for himself, a necessary lie to bring about a greater truth. The sharp crunch of tires on gravel was the starting gun. The low rumble of engines vibrated through the old floorboards, shaking the very foundation of my home. I moved quickly to the kitchen table, slumping my shoulders and letting my gaze drift aimlessly out the window, intentionally losing focus. Through the secure monitor feed on my phone tucked beneath a folded newspaper, I watched Silas's Lexus pull into the yard, closely followed by Leon's sleek SUV. They looked like business people, sharp and efficient, completely unaware they were stepping into a cage. How many times had I welcomed that son home, with open arms, never realizing I was embracing a viper? I felt a lethal focus sharpening my mind, even as I kept my face as blank as unwritten paper. The wolves are here. Time to open the door. As I watched the vehicles park, I noticed a third vehicle trailing behind the vultures. An unmarked white van that wasn't part of the plan. A cold dread shot through my veins as the realization hit me. It was Linda, the head nurse, arriving early to ensure the sedation protocol began before Breyer could intervene. They weren't just coming for a signature. They were coming to put me under completely. The doorbell rang with a cheerful, domestic chime that sounded like a death knell, and I took one final deep breath, saying goodbye to the man I used to be before standing up to play the fool. The front door opened, and Leon's sickeningly sweet perfume flooded the foyer like a chemical spill. I pulled the door open, letting my body sag into the fragile posture of a broken man, the chill of the evening rushing in to greet the 2 wolves standing on my welcome mat. Silas stepped forward, leading with a theatrical, shallow hug that felt like he was taking measurements for a casket. "You look good, Dad," he said, his voice dripping with a practiced pity that made my skin crawl. A little confused, but that's why we're here. Leon stood behind him, her eyes instantly scanning the foyer for any sign of the e-reader they thought they had secured. Behind them, in the deepening shadows of the driveway, I noticed the third vehicle, an unmarked white van. It confirmed that Linda, the head nurse, had arrived early, a silent vulture waiting to facilitate my removal the moment the ink dried. "I just wanted to see my children," I whispered, letting my gaze wander aimlessly. "The trees, they're talking too loud today." I quickly discovered Silas hadn't come alone. He had a private notary waiting in his car, ready to make my signature legally binding before the first course was even served. I led them into the dining room, where Briar was already seated. Her face was a cold mask, reflecting the sterile brightness of the chandelier overhead. Silas was visibly anxious, checking his watch every few minutes, sweat dampening the collar of his expensive dress shirt. The latches on Leone's briefcase snapped open, the sound sharp as a predator's jaws locking together in the quiet room. She took on the role of savior, speaking in a soothing, manipulative cadence about how much easier my life would become once I signed and handed over my burdens. "It's a wonderful facility, Thane," she cooed, sliding a leather-bound folder onto the dining table, pushing it between the untouched plates of food. "You'll have all the care Jessica wanted for you. Briar agrees we need to move quickly." I watched a moth flicker against the glass crystals overhead, its shadow dancing across the signature line. How many times does a man have to watch his own son try to bury him alive before he stops feeling the bite of the shovel? Silas roughly cleared a space on the table, flipping to the pages for the power of attorney and the Riverside admission documents. He accidentally revealed he had already promised the upcoming hazelnut harvest to a wholesale buyer in Salem, proving he was liquidating the farm's future before I even touched the pen. "Just sign right here, Dad," Silas urged, his hand visibly shaking with a mix of greed and nerves. "Then we can eat." Then everything gets simple again. I stared at the lines, pretending not to understand the concept of the pen. Where do I put the ink?" I asked, my voice weak and trembling. "My hands feel so heavy today." Silas leaned in, his heavy, damp breath sounding like a predator closing in on a wounded animal. I picked up the heavy fountain pen, its cold, tactile weight anchoring me to the reality of the trap. My nib hovered just millimeters above the line that would strip away my life. And right then, a sharp, electronic beep echoed from my pocket, the signal from Corbin, in the basement, that the recording was live and the trap was fully set. The pen clattered onto the table, like bone on a drum, and the confused fog vanished from my eyes as I straightened my spine, replaced by a cold, predatory clarity that made Silas recoil. I reached into my pocket and pressed a button on the remote, activating the whole house speaker system. Corbin had wired just hours earlier. The room didn't just fill with sound, it became haunted. Jessica's voice, clear and accusatory, poured from the dining room speakers, detailing the exact night she watched Silas swap her blood thinners for a lethal dosage of poison. The vultures froze mid-celebration, the color draining from their faces as they realized the confused old man they came to bury was actually a Trojan horse. "I'm not a thing, Silas," I said, my voice steady and lethal. "But your mother has a few words for you." Silas lunged for the folder, but I slapped my calloused hand down first. What he didn't realize was that I was broadcasting every single panic-stricken breath straight to Alaric's office, where a court reporter and 2 state investigators were logging every word as official testimony. Silas screamed at me to turn it off, claiming it was some kind of sick joke, but his eyes were wide with a terrifying realization. I switched the audio feed to the recording from his Lexus. The sharp distortion of the speakers didn't hide the laughter as they discussed manipulating Briar and stripping away my land. Briar stood up, her chair screeching against the hardwood floor. The fury burning in her eyes finally shut Silas up. "You used my medical license to kill our mother," she whispered, her words hitting Silas like a physical blow. "Stop," Silas stammered, the music in his head completely stopping, replaced by the sound of his own ruin as the recording kept playing. "It's not what it sounds like," he mumbled, staring at the ceiling as if the speakers were the judge and jury themselves. The recording switched to Leon's secret negotiations with Linda, the head nurse. Leon offered a 15% share of the fracking rights in exchange for ensuring my medical erasure. At that exact moment, the real Linda walked into the dining room from the kitchen carrying a tea tray. She instantly dropped it. The sound of shattering ceramic joined the mechanical hum of the audio. Linda didn't wait to be accused. She turned on Leon immediately, screaming that she had been forced into the deal, and that Leon had told her I was already at death's door. "Shut up!" Leon hissed, her face contorting into a mask of pure sociopathic rage. Linda revealed she had her own recording of Leon handing over the initial cash bribe. The smell of fear, sweat, and cold gravy hung heavy in the air as the two women began frantically blaming each other. Leon lunged across the table, her nails clawing toward my throat, her eyes reflecting the harsh glare of the chandelier. The exact moment she moved, the heavy thud of boots shattered the front door frame, and as the wood splintered inward, the world I once knew finally collapsed to make room for the truth. The dining room erupted into a kaleidoscope of blue and red lights as the first officers rushed into the sanctuary. The front door was breached, and the focused beams of tactical flashlights cut through the expensive candlelight like surgical lasers. Leon was intercepted mid-air by a broad-shouldered officer while she was still clawing at my throat. He slammed her down onto the mahogany table while she screamed profanities about asset interference and police brutality. Silas remained frozen in his chair, his face a pale, sweaty mask of shock. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the empty farmhouse, sounding far more final than any spoken word. When Leon Rose was told she was under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, she spat at the officer's boots, her sophisticated mask completely discarded. The chaos of the arrests stood in ugly contrast to the calm digital voice of Jessica, still looping in the background. A ghost, witnessing the collapse of the home she once loved. I stood perfectly still, watching the predators become the prey, feeling a heavy sense of justice that felt more like lead than gold in my chest. The lead detective began reading the Miranda warnings to a weeping Silas and a stone-faced Linda. Jessica's voice finally hissed into static, leaving only the sound of Silas sobbing. The sudden quiet was deafening. Silas collapsed to his knees, finally looking at me not as a victim, but as the man who had beaten him at his own game. Right there on the carpet, he began a frantic, incoherent confession, his words a cowardly mudslide. He claimed Leon's financial pressure forced his hand, but my disgust only deepened as he spoke about every single pill he had swapped in my wife's medication bottles. "You knew exactly what you were doing every time you opened that bottle, Silas," I said, my voice as cold as the Oregon dirt. In a final, desperate act of malice, he revealed he had never actually paid the deposit for Riverside. He had spent that money on a one-way ticket to a country with no extradition treaty, planning to leave me to rot in a state ward the moment the deed transfer went through. The handcuffs didn't just bind their wrists. They severed the final rotten branches from this family tree. The police led the three of them out into the freezing Oregon night, the smell of ozone and damp earth rushing through the ruined doorway. Standing on the porch, feeling Breyer's trembling hand supporting my arm, I watched the rhythmic pulse of the police lights dance across the old oak trees. One of the arresting officers paused as he passed me, his gaze softening, briefly. That was when I realized he was the son of the pharmacist Jessica had secretly visited, proving the local community had been quietly protecting me all along. "It's over, Dad," Briar whispered, her breath hitching in the biting valley wind. They're gone. I watched the taillights fade at the end of the long gravel driveway. No, Briar, I replied, my hand tightening on her shoulder. Now the real work begins. I turned back toward the house, but as the last police cruiser turned onto the main road, I caught sight of a lonely silhouette sitting at the edge of the hazelnut orchard, and my heart nearly stopped again. The figure in the shadows didn't move as I approached, looking tiny under the weight of the massive orchard. I just walked, my boots heavy against the damp Oregon dirt, heading toward the trembling shadow of the sun I had almost let the wolves consume. The air smelled of damp moss and decaying leaves, the unforgiving scent of a season turning cold. As I drew closer, I found Beckett curled at the base of an old hazelnut tree, hugging his knees and crying with a raw, heartbreaking intensity. When he saw me, he tried to scramble away in a frantic, uncoordinated motion. That was when I noticed his skin was clammy and his hands were shaking. And it wasn't just from fear. A sudden, sharp realization hit me. He had tried testing the supplements himself, exhibiting the same mild toxicity symptoms that Silas likely dismissed as simple withdrawals from his past addiction. "Don't touch me, Dad," Beckett wailed, his voice cracking. "I bought them. I killed her." I reached out and pulled him into a fierce embrace, not with anger, but with the desperate strength of a father refusing to let the darkness win. "You didn't buy poison, Beckett," I whispered into his hair. "You bought a lie. Look at me." I guided my nearly catatonic son back to the farmhouse, avoiding the dining room, where Leon's sickening perfume still hung like a stain in the air. I settled him into the study, the very room where Silas used to sit comfortably practicing his forgeries. Silence. The only sound in the farmhouse was the rhythmic, hollow ticking of the grandfather clock, measuring the ruins of our family. Beckett began stammering out the details of the dark web orders, his voice barely a whisper. He told me how Silas convinced him it would bring Jessica vitality, claiming I was too stubborn to save her. Every blue supplement he had lovingly handed his mother was a bullet Silas had chambered. "He weaponized your love for her, Beck," I told him, my voice thick with protective rage. "That is his burden, not yours. How do you repair a boy who was forged into a blade meant for his own mother's heart?" Alaric Benedict entered the study, then, his professional armor softening as he looked at my broken youngest son. He immediately invoked attorney-client privilege, his flint-like eyes promising a different kind of justice. Alaric explained that we needed to document every crypto transfer and every text message to ensure Silas and Leon never saw the sun as free citizens again. He placed a digital recorder on the desk, its low, rhythmic hum acting like a steady pulse in the room. I noticed the flickering shadows of the hazelnut branches against the study window, looking like reaching fingers. Alaric revealed the final piece of evidence he had uncovered. Silas had opened a hidden offshore account in Beckett's name. It was a final insurance policy, meant to pin the entire financial fraud on his own brother if the murder plot ever failed. A bitter taste filled my mouth as I looked at my son. "I'll tell you everything," Beckett whispered, his eyes bloodshot and full of terror. He looked up at me, pale in the light. "Dad, there's a second package. It's already in the house." The word package hit me like a physical blow, and my gaze darted around the study, searching for any sign of a hidden threat. I tore family photos off the mantelpiece, my heart hammering against my ribs, searching for the poison my son said was already staged to finish what Silas started. Beckett slumped back into the wingback chair, his voice raspy and hollow, as he pointed toward the corner of the room. He told me Silas had instructed him to hide a second package in case I became difficult before the Monday move. I walked over to the grandfather clock, its heavy, rhythmic ticking, sounding like a countdown to a funeral I wasn't ready to attend. My fingers searched the dark mahogany casing until they brushed against something smooth. I ripped away a small, vacuum-sealed pouch taped to the interior of the clock. It wasn't another slow-acting supplement. It was highly concentrated liquid warfarin, a lethal dose intended for my first night at Riverside to ensure my passing looked like a natural secondary stroke. I handed the pouch to Alaric, the clinical rustle of his evidence gloves sounding exceptionally loud in the quiet room. "This isn't just a chemical, Alaric," I said, my mouth coated with the taste of stale coffee and bitter regret. "It's the signature on my death warrant." Alaric nodded solemnly, his professional mask tightening as he secured the physical evidence linking Silas to the dark web activity. Alaric's phone vibrated on the oak desk, a sound like a guillotine blade sliding into place. It was 2 a.m, but the world of high-stakes law never sleeps. He used his high-level connections to bypass the local sheriff, contacting the state attorney general directly. Alaric had already transmitted the in-car recordings and crypto logs provided by Beckett, and the response was immediate. The farmhouse was now designated a Tier 2 crime scene, and the state was taking over the investigation to prevent any interference from Silas's business associates in the valley. I stood in the kitchen, watching an official digital search warrant materialize on Alaric's tablet. Breyer asked if this meant they finally believed us about Jessica, and Alaric simply looked at the screen with cold satisfaction. The Attorney General had seen enough. How do you explain to the earth that to prove a crime, you must take back what you already returned to it? As the sun began to rise over the hazelnut trees, the morning mist clinging to the windows like a shroud, the final order came down. The State Attorney General officially ordered the immediate exhumation of Jessica's remains. They needed the physical evidence to turn intent into a murder conviction. I stood by the window, watching the gray light hit the orchard, realizing justice demanded that I disturb the final rest of the woman I loved for 40 years. "They need her." "Thane," Alaric said softly but firmly. "The recordings show the plan, but her body holds the proof." I took a deep breath of the freezing morning mist and turned dirt drifting through the cracked window pane. "Wake her up then," I whispered. "Tell her I'm going to finish the harvest." Alaric revealed that the State Attorney General's office had already been flagged weeks ago by that pharmacist in McMinnville, proving a quiet net had been spreading long before I ever set foot in Portland. The lead investigator stepped onto the porch, the weight of the warrant clear in his eyes. "Mr. Garrison, the equipment is already at the cemetery. We need you to identify the plot." The cemetery was a sea of gray stone and iron gates, the morning mist clinging to the ground like a shroud. I stood at the edge of the family plot in the Willamette Valley. But as the metal teeth of the excavator bit into the dirt, it felt like the valley was giving up a secret it never intended to keep. The smell of damp peat and hydraulic fluid hung heavy in the air, a mechanical invasion of a sacred resting place. Flanked by Alaric and Breyer, I watched the rhythmic thudding of the machine with a hollow chest. My daughter's professional mask was back on as she discussed medical markers with the lead investigator. But I could see her hands shaking. Alaric tried to assure me they would be careful, but I told him careful was for the living. To Jessica, this was just one more violation. That was when I discovered the original coroner's report had been conveniently lost that confirmed server crash months ago. A detail that confirmed digital infrastructure. This wasn't just a murder. It was a systematic deletion of the truth. I kept a silent vigil until the vault was secured and loaded onto a specialized state transport vehicle. The heavy doors slammed shut, echoing among the white marble headstones like a cell door closing. The sound marked the end of her peaceful rest and the beginning of a cold, forensic reckoning. The lead detective informed me that the toxicology screen would be expedited, specifically targeting the chemical markers of the warfarin found in the second package from the clock. Every minute, Silas, she was out of the ground, felt like a minute. Silas was standing despite in free air, and that thought kept me standing despite the exhaustion. 24 hours later, I found myself in the sterile briefing room of the State Attorney General's office in Salem. Tuesday's gray, relentless rain battered the glass, and the room smelled of sharp bleach and old paper. The medical examiner, a woman with tired eyes and a firm voice, delivered the verdict. Jessica's liver and bone marrow showed warfarin levels 40 times the maximum therapeutic dose. The stroke that killed my wife was no accident. It was a catastrophic, deliberate hemorrhage. How many cubic centimeters of does it take to erase 42 years of marriage? I watched the medical examiner's hand sign the updated death certificate with a slow, deliberate grace. The scratching of the pen across that thick official paper was the most beautiful sound I had heard in weeks. The cause of death was no longer listed as natural. The word homicide stared back at me in bold black ink. Finally, the paper said what the e-reader had already told me. It wasn't a stroke, Thane, the examiner said softly. It was an execution. Alaric leaned in to reveal that the state had upgraded the charges against Silas and Leon to first-degree murder. In Oregon, that meant a mandatory life sentence without the possibility of parole. My son would spend the rest of his days behind the very bars he tried to build for me. Alaric placed a hand on my shoulder, his voice dropping to a whisper as the weight of it settled on us. Thane, Silas's lawyer is already calling. He wants to talk about a deal. The word deal tasted like iron and ash in my mouth. The legal system was a marketplace for buying and selling souls, and my oldest son was now trying to trade his partner's life just to buy himself a shorter sentence. Alaric sat across from me in his Portland office, his face a map of weary professional cynicism, as he detailed the terms Silas's lawyer had floated to the state prosecutor. My son wanted to trade Leon's head for his own freedom, offering to testify fully against her and Nurse Linda in exchange for dropping the murder charge down to manslaughter. He painted himself as a passive participant, a man supposedly coerced by Leon's dominant personality and financial expertise. I learned through Alaric that Silas had been recording Leon for months as insurance, proving he was planning to betray her long before the police ever knocked on our door. Tell that lawyer my son can keep his deal, I said, my voice as cold as the frost on a dead branch. I want the truth, not a bargain. I refuse to consider any terms until Silas faces the full weight of Jessica's recordings in open court. Hope is a dangerous weed in a garden of grief, but I still felt it tugging at my chest as I left the city behind. I drove east, climbing toward a quiet, wooded recovery center, tucked away in the Cascade Mountains. This was where Beckett had been placed for detoxification and psychological evaluation. The air was different here, smelling of pine needles and industrial floor cleaner, instead of the sharp perfumes of a crime scene. I waited in a sunlit visiting room, the sound of a distant creak echoing through the open window. I felt the familiar, heavy anxiety of a father who spent years preparing to face his son's next relapse. Beckett appeared minutes later, and the sight of him brought a sharp wave of relief. He looked gaunt, but for the first time in years, his eyes were clear, and his hands were steady as he sat across from me. "I didn't think you'd come, Dad," he whispered, his voice small. "I've been walking for 40 years for you, Beckett," I replied. "I'm not stopping now." I reached across the table and took his hand, noting the dry, paper-like texture of his skin. A pine cone hit the window, the tiny natural sound feeling louder than a gavel in the quiet room. We didn't talk about the case or the lawyers. Instead, Beckett asked about the hazelnut harvest and mentioned a specific grafting experiment Jessica had been working on before she passed. "Mom said the new grafts would take 3 years," he said, his gaze drifting toward the mountains. "I want to see them bloom." In that moment, I saw the boy who used to help me in the orchard before the pills took over. I realized that while Silas was rotten to the core, Beckett might still be saved. "Then, stay clean, Beck," I told him. "Those trees need a garrison to look after them." As I stood to leave, Beckett pulled me close, whispering a secret that sent a fresh jolt through me. He told me Jessica had left a physical letter hidden inside a hollow tree in the orchard, specifically for me to find once the legal storm had cleared. I walked to my truck, the biting Cascade air stinging my lungs, realizing I wasn't ready to go home just yet. I was going to find that hollow tree. The orchard was a sea of twisted branches and fading light as I stepped back onto my land, my boots finding the familiar ruts of the harvest paths. I walked straight to the hollow oak we called the wedding tree. My hand trembled as I reached into the dark cavity where Jessica promised her final truth would be. I discovered that the letter Beckett mentioned wasn't just a farewell note. It contained a second hidden e-reader, wrapped in oilcloth, holding video footage Jessica had captured of Leon personally handling the medication bottles in our kitchen. The discovery changed everything. Flash forward to the trial, and I stood in the center of the Yamhill County Courthouse. The air thick with the smell of old paper and high-stakes desperation. I watched Leon Ross adjust her designer suit, as if a sharp blazer could hide the blood on her hands. The trial began with the testimony of Mr. Henderson, the town's pharmacist of 30 years. He adjusted his glasses, his hands steady as he recounted Silas's multiple attempts to secure controlled blood thinners. Mrs. Garrison didn't look sick. She looked terrified. Henderson said, his small-town honesty acting as the bedrock of credibility. Terrified of her own kitchen. The defense team screamed objections of speculation, but the jury was already leaning in. The activation of the recorder felt like chambering a round in a pistol. The prosecution presented the files recovered from my cloud backup, and a dead silence fell over the courtroom as the recording of Leon and Silas in the Lexus played out. Hearing Leon describe me as disposable overhead caused a visible wave of disgust among the jurors. Silas sat with his head down, a broken man who had already traded his soul for a plea bargain. "It's just business, Silas." Leon's voice vibrated through the high-fidelity speakers, shaking the floor beneath my feet. "The land doesn't care whose name is on the deed." Leon's attorney attempted to have the audio suppressed, but the judge's face remained as cold as granite. How much does a man's soul weigh when it's measured in cubic centimeters of poison? Breyer took the stand next as a medical expert witness, her credentials as a cardiologist lending undeniable weight to the toxicology reports. She explained the chemical execution to the jury, using simple, brutal metaphors to describe how the warfarin slowly dissolved Jessica's vascular system from the inner layers out. "My mother didn't have a stroke," Breyer said, her professional mask finally dropping to expose the absolute hatred of a daughter as she looked directly at Leon. She was drowned by her own blood. During the testimony, Silas's lawyer dropped one final shocking twist, a document showing Leon had attempted to quietly take out a life insurance policy on Silas as well, implying my son was intended to be her next target. The revelation turned the two co-conspirators into rabid animals. Leon's calm exterior finally shattered completely. She stood up in front of the judge and screamed at Silas, her sharp, rhythmic pen-tapping replaced by clawing fingers. I stopped looking at her. I looked at the door as the bailiff brought in the final, unexpected witness. The courtroom doors creaked open, and the silence that followed was heavier than the evidence we had already presented. I watched the color drain from Leon's face as the man she thought she had silenced. Arthur Vance, a man who looked like he spent his life in windowless server rooms, walked toward the stand. He adjusted his tie with a trembling hand as he stepped into the light, holding a folder packed with her digital footprint. Arthur had been the IT director at her firm until he was fired over financial discrepancies, but he hadn't left empty-handed. He revealed to the court that he had archived Leon's encrypted communications, refusing to be her digital cleaner any longer. He presented clear logs of Leon, coordinating the purchase of the online supplements, and her direct, cold-blooded negotiations with the energy company. I felt a surge of heat when he revealed Leon had even begun the paperwork to declare Silas incapacitated as well, intending to keep the entirety of the fracking profits for herself. The evidence was so absolute that Leon's own attorney insisted she take the stand. A desperate gamble to humanize a predator. Silence. You could hear a pin drop, or perhaps the sound of a woman's soul finally hitting the floor as she took the oath. Leon's voice dripped with condescending arrogance from the moment she began to speak. She described my family as a series of liabilities and argued that her actions were a matter of necessary management for land that was being wasted by an old man and an addict. Land. She refused to acknowledge Jessica's passing as anything other than an unfortunate matter of timing, sending a literal chill through the gallery. Her expensive, heavy perfume drifted toward the front rows like a warning. "Some people are the architects of progress," she said, her voice vibrating with an arrogant edge. "And some people are just obstacles." I was gripped by a cold horror watching her look at the jury, clearly convinced of her own superior logic. On cross-examination, the prosecutor asked if my wife was simply an obstacle to her commission. Leon lost her composure, her eyes flashing under the courtroom lights. She roared that the weak were meant to be managed, defending the administration of the poison as an act of mercy. She claimed the physiological decline was happening anyway, and she had simply accelerated a messy process. Her words were like dry ice, burning cold, and leaving nothing behind but scars and a faint chemical mist in the air. The jury stared at her in horrified silence, and a visible gasp erupted from the room when she smiled. "I didn't kill her. I liberated the land from her stagnation," she screamed. Her sophisticated exterior finally shattered beyond repair. Leon then revealed she had hidden offshore accounts the state hadn't even found yet, taunting the court that the money was the only true witness. "No further questions," the prosecutor said, his calm voice a stark contrast to her mania. Let the record show the defendant's own words. The judge brought down his gavel to silence, the erupting gallery, the sharp, rhythmic thuds echoing like a final judgment. Leon simply looked at me and blinked, a gesture so vile it made the victory feel like a fresh wound. I felt sick, but I didn't look away. Watching her seal her own fate in a room full of people who finally saw the monster Jessica had given her life to expose. The wood of the courtroom bench felt like a funeral pew, hard and unforgiving, as I watched the 12 strangers holding my family's ultimate verdict line up and walk back to the jury box. I sat between Briar and Alaric, the air smelling of floor wax and stale air. My daughter reached over, her hand trembling as she gripped mine tightly. "Whatever happens, Dad, we did it for her," she whispered. I looked straight ahead, my face a mask of stoic resignation. "It's out of our hands now, Briar," I replied. "It's in the truth." I looked across at Silas, who was shaking so violently his water glass rattled against the defense table in a rhythmic, warning cadence. Just before the judge entered, my son attempted to fire his attorney. A final, pathetic effort to delay the proceedings that exposed the absolute desperation of a man who knew the earth was about to swallow him up. The bailiff called for order, and the electric hum in the room seemed to intensify. Leon sat as still as a marble statue, her cold, unblinking gaze locked onto the seal of the state of Oregon, as if she could negotiate with the wall. The judge asked the foreperson if a verdict had been reached. The judge's gavel struck the woodblock, a sound like a bone snapping in a quiet room. And Silas's verdict was read first. Guilty of murder in the first degree, guilty of conspiracy, guilty of financial fraud. Silas let out a sharp, piercing wail that echoed down from the high ceiling, collapsing into his chair as if his bones had turned to water. "No! No!" he screamed, his sobbing, wet voice filling the corridor. "I just wanted the money. I didn't mean to kill her." Then came Leon's verdict, its conclusion, identical in its finality. She didn't flinch, but I watched her jaw tighten just a fraction of an inch. The judge ordered both defendants remanded into immediate custody, pending sentencing. I listened to the sharp metallic ring of the handcuffs tightening around their wrists, a sound that carried more weight than any ledger. Their malice was a thick mist that finally cleared, leaving the wreckage of my life exposed to the sun. As the bailiffs began to lead them away, Leon finally turned her head to look at me. "You think you won, Thane?" she hissed, her voice like a poisoned needle. "You're still just an old man alone in the dirt." She leaned in to whisper as she passed, stating she had already filed for bankruptcy to ensure my family would spend years fighting for the fracking rights in probate court. It was the final strike of a dying serpent. I watched Silas being led out with his face in his hands, while Leon walked with her chin up, refusing to acknowledge defeat even as the iron gates waited for her. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The legal battle was won, but the house I was going back to was still empty. I walked out of the courthouse and into the fading light. The orange glow of the setting sun hit the steps, stretching out jagged shadows. I walked to my truck, the keys heavy in my pocket, but I didn't get in. Arthur Vance was waiting by the gates with a man I didn't recognize, a man holding a federal badge that caught the last light of day. The federal agent didn't look like a man interested in small-town justice. Not into the rain. He looked like a man interested in the millions moving through Leon's offshore accounts. Standing on the courthouse steps, the federal agent's shadow stretching long across the pavement, I realized that while the state had taken the people who killed my family, The government was coming for their money. Agent Miller, a man wearing a suit as gray as his eyes and carrying a federal badge that felt heavier than the law itself, was waiting by my truck. He explained that Leon's consulting firm was nothing more than a front for a multi-state racketeering operation involving fraudulent energy leases. That was when I discovered that Miller's presence was actually requested by Alaric months ago. My attorney had woven a tight net of protection so that even if she managed to walk free in state court, federal shackles would be waiting for her. Arthur Vance stood beside him, revealing he had been acting as a federal informant for weeks, providing the digital breadcrumbs needed to freeze the offshore accounts Leon had so arrogantly bragged about. Does this mean she won't have a single cent left for an appeal? I asked, feeling a calculated satisfaction wash over me. Miller simply nodded, noting they didn't care about the murder, only the paper trail that allowed it to happen. The energy company was about to be completely dismantled from the top down. A month later, I returned for the final reckoning. The courtroom was packed for the sentencing phase, the air thick, with the smell of old paper and heavy wood. Breyer and Beckett sat on either side of me, a broken but united front against the darkness. Nurse Linda was sentenced first. She received 15 years for elderly abuse and conspiracy, and her nursing license was permanently revoked. She tried to apologize, her voice a pathetic whimper, but I refused to look at her, focusing instead on the deep grain of the oak bench. Druzala dwe kanhuja tswe shenshin sinrin de bepan, the judge announced, her words cutting through the sterile quiet. The judge's gavel came down one last time, a final punctuation mark to a long, dark chapter. The judge saved her harshest words for Silas and Leon, citing the premeditated and predatory nature of their betrayal. She sentenced both to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Silas had to be carried out of the room, his spirit completely broken, his raw wails echoing through the gallery. Leon was led out in transport chains, the metallic clinking marking her pace as she avoided my gaze. As Silas was dragged past, a final realization hit me like a physical blow. The second package of poison hadn't been a backup for him to use. Leon had staged it to eliminate Silas as well, intending to get rid of the final witness to her greed. In her eyes, he had always been a liability, a tool to be discarded once the harvest was complete. Justice isn't a warm blanket. It's the cold, hard floor you hit when you finally stop falling. I walked out of the courthouse, the chill of the parking lot, one wind tasting like a promise of peace. Suddenly, the phone in my pocket vibrated. It was a message from Alaric. Federal agents located the physical assets. You need to come to the office. The resolution wasn't a closed door, but the opening of the earth. The rhythmic thud of shovels cutting into the damp, dark dirt didn't feel like digging a hole. It felt like preparing the foundation for the next century. Under a clear morning sky, I watched Breyer and Beckett work together to position the first hazelnut sapling. The cold metal touch of the shovel handle was a grounding weight against the warmth of the sun on my neck. The tension of the trial was replaced by a quiet, focused collaboration, as if the physical act of planting was finally healing the rot Silas had left behind. I realized the 150 legacy trees we were planting weren't just crops. They were a living barrier against the corporate interests that tried to swallow this valley. I discovered Jessica had set up a digital dead man switch on the e-reader, configured to automatically transmit all files to the FBI if the device went accessed past a certain date. She had planned for every failure, including my own potential silence. "Hold it steady, Beck," Breyer said, her voice soft but firm. "Let the roots spread out." Mom always said they need room to breathe. Beckett nodded frantically, his eyes clearer than I had seen them in a decade. "I've got it," he replied. "This one goes in the north corner. It's going to be the tallest of the batch." As the first tree was secured, we took a moment to breathe in the scent of damp, rich soil and budding hazelnut trees. Breyer discussed her plans for a new clinic, while Beckett mentioned his progress in a management program. The orchard was no longer a crime scene. It was a cathedral built of wood and light, where the only judgment would be the upcoming rain. "The conservation easement papers were finalized yesterday, Dad," Breyer said, wiping a smear of dirt from her forehead. "No one will ever drill here." "Good," I replied, leaning against my spade. "Let the only things that grow from this dirt be hazelnuts and memories." The rhythmic sound of the wind moving through the orchard clearing felt like the land itself sighing in relief. I went back toward the house to grab water for the kids, but I found myself drawn to the e-reader resting on the porch table. As I went to check the planting charts, the blue glow of the screen caught my eye in the shadows. A digital notification sounded like a bell from the bottom of a well. It was a hidden file, programmed to unlock only after the formal conclusion of the trial. The title was just a few words: "For Thane." A final note. My hand shook as I touched the glass, realizing Jessica had one last thing to say that had nothing to do with crimes or vultures. "I thought the recordings were over. I thought I knew all your secrets, Jess." The final file revealed she knew about the health issues I had hidden from her, the heart condition I kept quiet to spare her worry. And she had recorded a message specifically to guide me through my own recovery after she was gone. I pressed play, and as Jessica's voice filled the porch, her tone carried no harsh accusations or heavy grief. It was as light as the wind through the trees, and she spoke the last words I ever expected to hear. The first word out of her mouth wasn't my name, but a promise she had made 40 years ago. Jessica's voice didn't demand retribution. She asked me to remember that even the most scarred land can bear sweet fruit if you have the patience to let the rot burn away. As I sat on the porch, the recording revealed a digital trust fund Jessica had built over the years. Hidden beneath layers of code Silas could never touch, specifically designated to fund Beckett's recovery and long-term care. It was her final move in the game, protecting the pawn she knew was the most vulnerable. A year has passed since that morning on the porch, and the Garrison farm has flourished under its new conservation status. It's autumn in Oregon, a season of long, golden light and the intoxicating scent of roasting hazelnuts. Beckett and I stood in the main orchard, watching the steady mechanical hum of the harvesting equipment moving between the rows of trees. Clear-eyed and steady-handed, Beckett supervised the largest harvest in our family history with a quiet sense of purpose. The fruit on these trees weighted the branches down, growing from the very dirt Silas had dismissed as worthless. "Look at the weight on these branches, Dad," Beckett said, a smile breaking across his weathered face. "Mom was right about the new grafts." "She usually was, Beck," I replied, leaning my back against the rough bark of a sturdy oak. It just took the rest of us a little time to catch up to her pace. The rhythmic hum of the harvester replaced that once haunted these groves, marking the valley's return to its natural order. Flames consumed the first envelope, the orange glow tasting like freedom. Late that afternoon, I went back to the house and found a stack of unopened mail from the Oregon Unstate Penitentiary, all of them from Silas. For a year, he had sent weekly barrages of apologies, justifications, and desperate demands for money to fund new legal appeals. I took them to the backyard, the weight of the paper, feeling like a burden I no longer needed to carry, for a son who still refused to accept true accountability. He was still trying to sell me a version of the truth that I had already buried. Some seeds are just too rotten to ever take root. I dropped the stack into a rusty burn barrel, the warmth of the metal comforting in the chilly evening air. I watched the fire lick at the desperate for familiar handwriting. The smoke was a gray silhouette dancing over the orchard, the only spirit here that didn't belong to the land. I stood there until nothing was left but white ash, feeling the final claw marks of the vultures loosen from my heart. The crisp rustle of the burning paper was the only eulogy Silas deserved. "Rest easy, Jessica," I whispered as the sun dipped below the horizon. "The house is quiet now. Let the wind take the rest." Before the fire turned to charcoal, I caught a glimpse of the final letter in the stack. Silas had started a consulting venture from inside the prison walls, proving that the wolf inside him hadn't changed one bit. I turned away from the embers, but as I reached the porch, I saw a familiar silhouette standing by the front door. This time, it wasn't a predator, but a visitor I had spent a lifetime waiting to properly welcome. The gate creaked, a sound I once feared, signaled the arrival of a predator, but now it sounded like the greeting of an old friend. I no longer needed to check the monitor feeds. I knew it was the slow, steady arrival of Alaric Benedict's heavy sedan. It brought the weight of the law to my land one last time, but for the right reasons. Alaric stepped out as the car stopped, but he wasn't alone. A woman from the state archives accompanied him. They were here to officially register Jessica's hybrid trees as a historic agricultural landmark, ensuring her brilliance would be etched into the state's heritage. Together, we walked out to the center of the newly protected 50 acres. The golden autumn sun filtered through the leaves as we gathered around a granite boulder at the boundary of the easement. Beckett and Breyer helped me pull away the canvas, revealing a simple bronze plaque. I ran my fingers over the cool, smooth surface, reading the words, "The Jessica Garrison Memorial Registry." Alaric read the official charter aloud, his voice steady, as he delivered the legal terms that permanently banned any future industrial drilling or extraction on this plot. "She always wanted the orchard to be a sanctuary," Alaric said, looking down the rows of trees. "Now it's permanent." The law had finally caught up to the land, and the greed that almost consumed this soil was buried forever. We moved deeper into the orchard, where one final hole remained. Tree number 150. The hybrid strain Jessica spent years perfecting stood in its burlap wrap. I invited Beckett and Breyer to hold the sapling with me, their hands steady as they positioned the future. I took the shovel, the rhythmic sound of metal meeting damp dirt acting as the pulse of this quiet valley. As I shoveled the last of the rich soil over the roots, I realized the truth didn't just exist in recordings or court transcripts. It lived on in the resilience of the life we preserved. By donating this land, I had effectively made the remaining leases surrounding the energy company worthless. Their multi-million-dollar gamble collapsed because one old man refused to move, delivering a final blow to the vultures from beyond Jessica's grave. The truth, much like a hazelnut tree, is a slow-growing thing. It takes years to establish its roots, but once it does, no storm can shake it loose. "That's the last one, Dad," Breyer whispered as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of honey and violet. "The cycle is closed." "This isn't the end, Beck," I said, looking at my youngest son. "It's the first day of the rest of the forest." The peace of a valley with no more secrets settled over us, smelling of crushed hazelnut leaves and cold granite. I walked back to the porch alone, picking up the e-reader one final time. I watched the screen flicker, the battery down to its last percentage of life. It displayed the final photo Jessica had taken, a picture of me looking out toward the horizon from behind, paired with a simple caption. "I knew you'd find me, Thane." I let the battery die, the screen going black just as the first stars appeared. I looked up and saw a flash of white fabric moving between the rows of trees. Not the ghost of a victim, but the guardian of this land. When I look back on everything that happened, I realize this was never just a victory over a crime. It was a mirror showing me where I had been blind. For years, I believed that love and hard work alone could protect a family. But this story taught me that silence can be dangerous. When we ignore warning signs simply because they come from the people we love, we give betrayal the room it needs to grow. Some people online might call what I did a father's account. But the reality is far more complicated. My actions were never about hatred. It was about refusing to let greed erase the life my wife built beside me. This journey forced me to face a painful truth. Being a father doesn't mean closing your eyes when your children walk into the darkness. Sometimes, love means standing up against them. If there's one lesson I want to leave behind, it's this: don't make the mistake I almost made. Pay attention to the subtle shifts, the quiet untruths, and the moments when your heart tells you something isn't right. A family's story can be a legacy of trust, or a warning of what happens when the truth is ignored. And what some call a father's account is, sometimes, simply a man choosing justice over fear. In my darkest moments, I remember something my wife once told me. The universe doesn't promise us a life without storms, but it gives us the strength to navigate through them without losing our souls. That reminder kept me standing when everything else collapsed. If my actions meant anything, it was to protect the truth so the next generation could grow in better soil. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. I really want to hear your perspective. What would you have done if you faced a dilemma like Thane's? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss future narratives about resilience and difficult choices.